Brussels. This is September the 1st, 1978. This is tape number 350 from Carmel, California. Well, it's pretty good to be back after 2 weeks vacation. I was up in Canada for 2 weeks. A lot of people thought I wasn't away. They were sure I was at the hearings in Washington or glued to the television set, that I couldn't possibly take off at the time James Earl Ray was testifying. But we did. I had promised my daughter and our niece and friend and we would take this vacation. It was a much-needed vacation, and I loved to go camping, and we went for 2 weeks. At first, I was going to make a tape. I made a tape for you on the hazards of Mae Brussell's traveling, an itemized list of all the things that have happened to me on various trips that are most unusual and some of them pretty scary. And it took just about one half of this tape, so I'm erasing it, and I'm just going to go right into the James Earl Ray testimony. Sometime, if you're interested in knowing about those hazards, I'll do a tape cassette for you on it. But I think right now the House Select Committee is more important than the impossible and dangerous hazards that happened to Mae Brussell and family on her trips. So we'll get right into those. While I was away, Betty Phillips of the Tape Center taped the entire set of the hearings. And if any of you want these tape cassettes, the Famous Voices Museum here in Pacific Grove, California, will duplicate them and has the sets for you. There are 7 sets, that's 14 hours of hearings, and they have edited out all the pauses and lapses so that these sets are available, and I believe the total is $55 or $3.50 for each cassette, plus 6% tax in California. From the time that the House Select Committee was formed in Washington, D.C., I knew it would be a total failure, and I've spoken about that many times on the various programs and on Dialogue Conspiracy. I take it back. I don't mean a total failure. I mean every time that Washington has an investigation of this type, it is excellent to have it televised and put into the congressional testimony, and also we will be able to purchase from the government printing office the House Select Committee's work on the assassination of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy, President John Kennedy. The wonderful good thing about this is that you can view how these cover-up artists work, and you get a better picture of the manipulation of both the media and the minds of the Americans and the collusion at the highest level of the Justice Department, the way they can spend millions of dollars and come to erroneous conclusions and outright errors and accept falsified evidence and witness perjury and do a terrible job. If we had no investigation, you wouldn't be able to see how these people operate. There was no public investigation material made available on Robert Kennedy's assassination as there was in the John Kennedy assassination. But I maintained all along, if you studied that, as I did for 8 years before I even publicly went on the air or wrote one article, if you just study it extensively, you break down the formula of investigations whereby the highest officials appear to be doing something while they're not doing it at all. And it's a good guideline. Somebody who takes these tapes in Illinois wrote to me and said that even though he's acquired a great many of them, he was a little skeptical of what I said about the FBI and the CIA covering up until James Earl Ray was called before the House Select Committee. And as he watched the committee operate, he became more and more convinced that the things that I'm saying probably are true, and he's more in my camp now than he was before because he can see them operating. And that is the important thing. It was worth the $3 million to the taxpayers to just see these bastards operate. Now, the specifics of the case. I'm going to jump around. I came home and typed, made up for all my vacation by typing up over 150 pages of James Earl Ray's testimony and the questions, and I have them all before me, and we'll jump around certain things that are important I will get to right away, and I won't be able to cover all, but we'll do the best we can. One of the first persons that was called to testify was a pathologist, Dr. Michael M. Baden, and he looked at the x-rays and autopsy reports of the murder of Martin Luther King, and he was very sure that he could not determine the path of the bullet that killed Martin Luther King. Well, he said it was possible or consistent, entirely consistent, that a shot could have come from the rooming house bathroom. He said he couldn't rule out the possibility that it also could have come from some other spot or a bushy area alongside of the rooming house. Harold Weisberg, in his book Frame Up, talks about the fact that there was commotion outside the rooming house. Below the bathroom window, there's a vacant lot that he writes about that's covered with bushes 12 to 15 feet high. And Dr. King's chauffeur, by the name of Solomon Jones, told reporters just a few minutes after the shooting, I'm reading from Harold Weisberg's book, that just after the shot was fired, a man with a sheet over his head ran out of the bushes heading south. Another witness, with the nickname of Cornbread, Carter, said that he saw a man fire a shot from the bushes and then take off. And Weisberg noted that there's a concealed position in the firehouse where the police could be watching the area of Dr. Martin Luther King. You see, the implication that Ray bought binoculars and he was watching King still doesn't explain how in the world he would know that Martin Luther King was in that building. But the Memphis police were, in quotes, guarding him, and the FBI knew he was there. And they had a clear view of, in quotes, protecting him, similar to Thane Caesar, the security guard protecting Robert Kennedy in the Ambassador Hotel. And the firemen and the police heard the shot, and they all thought, according to this Cornbread Carter, there's a quotation, that it came from the bushes and not from the window 20 feet above. Now, you notice the House Select Committee hasn't sought these witnesses, Solomon Jones, the driver for Martin Luther King, his chauffeur. They haven't asked this Mr. Carter. They seem to be searching for witnesses that would confirm where James Earl Ray was at the time, even though he hasn't established where he was at the time. But they made no effort to call any policeman or fireman from those buildings where they could see Martin Luther King, and the committee, of course, didn't have any intention of calling these people that saw somebody with a sheet over his head running from the bushes at the time that Martin Luther King was killed. I had the distinct impression that James Earl Ray, listening to his voice, I didn't get a chance to see him on the TV, but listening carefully to the tapes and recounting his story is still under some kind of a mind control. This has never been brought up, of course. The fact, one of the congressmen cited 55 incidences that were part of a statement that James Earl Ray agreed upon when he pleaded guilty, but they mentioned his taking a lock, he called it a lock-picking course. That was funny. He's going to be a lock picker. They talked about his bartending and his dancing classes and his activities and his face surgery, but nobody mentioned that he had been to a hypnotist in Los Angeles, even though that came out a few years ago, that James Earl Ray had gone to a hypnotist in Los Angeles. And he also, when he was arrested in London, he had 3 books on hypnotism with him. And there is no suggestion in all of this, of course, of a chance that he could be under mind control. And yet there were things that he said that I may jump around with that indicated that also that his mind was affected. Ray didn't show any antagonism towards Raul at all. He just accepted the fact that they were going to be part of a crime, that he would use a different name, a criminal act would take place. He called New Orleans to see what happened up there in Memphis. He doesn't ask the committee if they ever checked to see if the rifle that was taken from the rooming house with his prints on it was later checked to see if it even had been fired that day or fired at all. And he didn't ask them to check out why Raul would carry the bundles, or if the description that the people saw in the rooming house was even Raul, if the choice had to be either Ray or Raul, or if there was even a third person, a different man, if Raul didn't just direct him like George de Morenschel directed Lee Harvey Oswald, and a different person just ran from the rooming house. He's never curious about the fact that this could just be a planted thing. He doesn't bring this up at all, that it could be all swept up into this bedspread without fingerprints of another person for the purpose of making him a patsy. He suggests the deprivation, the treatment that he had affected his mind, but of course the subject of chemicals never comes up. Food or drugs or medical treatment. At first they give him the lights and solitary confinement. As he said, after 7 or 8 months it begins to work on you. He knows he wasn't there, but he doesn't know any more than that. And he was told, I'm sure prior to the assassination of Martin Luther King, that something was going to happen, but he may get a small rap as a co-conspirator, he said. That was his impression. He'd be a co-conspirator but he would get 7 to 15 years gladly, and that would be it. And yet he doesn't mention who. He mentions Raoul, but he has no anger towards him. He mentions calling him in New Orleans like he's calling a parent, like a father figure, a case officer, like George de Mohrenschildt was to Lee Harvey Oswald. James Earl Ray said he called to see if a crime was committed, but he knew a crime was going to be committed. He had purchased a rifle on instructions, and he said that Raoul had assigned him. He used the word, I carefully typed up all of these cassettes. They're very valuable to type up. He said Raoul assigned rooms to him, and he was assigned to this rooming house. He went there, and he left a gun there. He left binoculars. He used a different name, John Willard, because he knew a crime was going to be committed. And he didn't want to use the regular name that the car was registered under, the Galt name. He knew the rifle wasn't for gun running. You know, you don't do big gun running by getting a single gun in Birmingham, Alabama, you know, with binoculars and putting it in a room. And he didn't wonder if somebody used his gun. I mean, that subject never came up. They never asked him, did you think anybody could have used the gun, you know, after you purchased it? There was no question by the committee towards James Earl Ray on that subject. And he said he got in his car and he fled, and he went to call New Orleans to see if a crime was committed. So evidently he wanted to know if his team was involved, because here's a former convict who's escaped, who has credible identification. He has the name Galt, he has a car registered in his name and the ID. He could have gone to the nearest gas station or restaurant and stayed in there while they investigated the assassination of Martin Luther King, and he would be seen and nobody would question him. The fleeing was what made people go after him. Even though the evidence can't link him to the murder, he had to have instructions, just like Candy Jones would go to Taiwan. Candy Jones, in the book The Control of Candy Jones, could get her memory erased. She had a double personality. She could be at the intelligence agency and have carrots put in her vagina and burns on her body and give demonstrations of holding up against pain or talking. And I'm sure that James Earl Ray might have been programmed to actually think that he was Galt. He knew that he was a partner in something, but the mind control is still evidence, and the demonstrations at the intelligence agencies of Candy Jones are no different than the demonstration on national television of James Earl Ray. There is this naivete, the sharpness about certain things, and the lack of anger towards Galt, and consistent, you know, like I'll just serve 15 years as a co-conspirator, and not worried about the evidence planted against him. He says, I would plead guilty again under the circumstances, and it's obvious that he is taking some kind of instructions hypnotically that have kept him locked in accepting certain parts of the story consistent with what he was probably promised, that you will get another trial, that you will get a hearing, and so forth. And this placates him, and he is getting attention, and he is getting hearings, but he's just as muddled as he was 10 years ago. When James Earl Ray was explaining his escape from the Missouri jail, which I'll go into in a little while, that's important, he told how he stayed 2 or 3 nights by a train track and then went to a trailer that was open, that had wine and food. We never know whose trailer that was. Nobody testified or was ever called at any time. Certainly he was told to plead guilty. He had no trial. But the House Select Committee, I am positive, has never located the owner of the trailer that conveniently had food or wine. Now that could be an assist in his escape that nobody has even asked about, that he conveniently has this kind of assistance. And then he goes on to Kansas City and then St. Louis. And he said in quotes on these tapes, I went to the residence of an individual called Mr. Gorn, a nickname of the Cat Man. And I intended for Mr. Gorn, or Dorn, to arrange for his transportation to Edwardsville. And Dorn wasn't home. So he said, I just caught a taxi and went to East St. Louis. And the House Select Committee never, of course, would call Mr. Dorn as a witness and ask who he is, who is the cat man, and why did James Earl Ray assume that he was going to arrange transportation. You see, I had heard through some research or an article that the warden of the Missouri jail was an officer with the Bay of Pigs operation, an attorney, that he's a lawyer. And James Earl Ray is very carefully protecting, he says over and again, he's protecting the people who helped him escape from the Missouri penitentiary. Now, the escape is important because there was a cellmate with James Earl Ray by the name of Bridgman, and later he meets another Bridgman and has the alias of Bridgman, who's traveling to Florida. And this man is in the cell with James Earl Ray, and he hears that there's this large amount of money offered for killing Martin Luther King. And shortly after this man hears about it, a year later, this was in 67, by 1968, James Earl Ray was arrested, and he was surprised that his old cellmate was charged with the crime because while he was in jail, there was talk about money being offered to kill Martin Luther King. Now, this is way beyond coincidence that this money is talked about in the Missouri jail, and then James Earl Ray is arrested a year and a half later. But the warden was never called and should be called. As I say, I think he's an attorney. He worked with the Bay of Pigs, which would mean with E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker and the Watergate plumbers, the same people that were able to go to the CIA and get aliases and false names and documents for people. And the escape from the jail is primary because, first of all, as I say, the trailer that was available, and second, this Mr. Dorn, the committee just completely passes that over. They don't ask, who is he? They keep trying to pin all of the responsibility on James Earl Ray, Jerry Ray, and John Ray. They want to make it a family affair and not a conspiracy, and yet they don't go into the warden's story. And Ray intimates several times that he had help leaving the jail and that he didn't want to get anyone in trouble. Therefore, he wasn't going to expose this story. But he goes to Dorn, and Dorn isn't there. But why did he think that he was going to help him and arrange the transportation? Now, the day before James Earl Ray escaped, in quotes, escaped from Missouri, his brother, Jerry Ray, visited him. But his brother, it works for Mr. Stoner of the States' Rights Party, the man who is against blacks and Jews, a known racist who works with wealthy people who do not want labor unions and blacks incorporated into the power structure, the labor market, anywhere in the country, much less the South. And Jerry Ray is a known racist, and he might have had contacts or been a conduit because the day that James Earl Ray escapes, he has the alias of Raines. And that's an interesting thing because how many people have a Social Security card in their hands? He couldn't counterfeit this or photograph this in a jail or prison. Certainly in Missouri he couldn't be doing this. And they must go through their documents and papers in the jail. And when families visit, things that are exchanged are usually noticed by guards. And yet Jerry Ray visited James Earl Ray and was never asked and never will be asked on a stand. And James Earl Ray was never asked, did your brother bring you false identification? I think there's more chance that Jerry Ray brought him the Raines card that could have been printed by the CIA way in advance than there was that Jerry Ray got involved in a bank robbery in Illinois. Well, this man that was supposed to arrange the transportation that wasn't home was contacted later, and James Earl Ray went back to the town, East St. Louis, and bought a Plymouth for $200, and then he called Jack, the cat man, and he purchased a pistol for him, he says, from a fence, and he told Gorn, reach my family and tell them I'm leaving the country, and I will contact them later, and don't mention that you saw me. So he did make contact. An ex-con was able then to pick up a weapon. He had a false ID. He crosses to Canada, and he goes through from Detroit, Michigan, which is a nice place to go over. I have mentioned before on the tapes that the car of John Kennedy now rests in the basement of the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan, where it should be taken to Washington and examined for the investigation into the murder of John Kennedy. Detroit, Michigan, he may have met other people. Henry Ford has been described over and over in books as a conduit of tremendous anti-Semitism in this country. He printed the Prodigals of Elder Zion. He whipped up the mentality of people of Jerry Ray and Stoner in the South and fed them a lot of anti-Semitic literature and sent it all over the world. Henry Ford is mentioned. I was reading Facts and Fascism on my vacation by George Seldes, and he describes the Ford Motor Company and Charles Lindbergh and the Hearst organizations and their Nazi connections. The Ford Motor Company has been notorious and has even had a role, as I say, in the Kennedy assassination, keeping the car of John Kennedy there in their possession so it can't be examined, the metal frame from the inside, to see if there's still some marks of the bullets in that car. So, no, the question is never asked, did he see any person in Detroit, Michigan, where this Orloff, who was with Marina Oswald and George de Mohrenschildt, and Orloff had been with Henry Ford, Zaras from Russia had been with Henry Ford, the older one. But the Ford Foundation, incidentally, coincidentally, is funding the public broadcasting of the James Earl Ray interrogation of the House Select Committee. And I thought that was pretty funny that the Ford Foundation is doing this for KQED. But the question, of course, is never asked when he goes from Detroit to Michigan if he saw anyone in Detroit. Did he really rob the whorehouse? Because there's no way of checking that out. They can't call the police and say, we were robbed, or what's your business, we're prostitutes. So the $1,700 that he says he got from a whorehouse could have come from Detroit, Michigan, until he gets his papers and money from Raoul to begin his traveling. But James Earl Ray has never asked about contacts in Detroit, which would be a logical place to pick up him some more money after he has a car and a gun, and he's been in Illinois. As I say, this one person is never called, the warden's never called, Mr. Dorn is never called, and these are important witnesses that we'll never hear from by the House Select Committee. James Earl Ray was describing on the first cassette, tape 1, side 2, that he went to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and then he came back from Mexico into the United States, but from Tijuana in the United States, and when they searched his Mustang and they came across the border, there was a business card in his Mustang that said New Orleans, Leaa, and it had the name of a Randolph Irwin Rosen, Rosen. And Playboy magazine, in an effort to discredit James Earl Ray, came out with an article in 1977, September 77, which he was furious about at the time and was going to sue them. But he was very mild on TV. This is why I think there was some kind of control. When they brought up the subject of the Playboy article, there was no anger or emotion in James Earl Ray about the way he's been framed. He's very calm about it. And he said that the Playboy article looked into the inconsistencies of what he said, and that there was no LEAA, the law enforcement agency. It was formed after the murder of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy until 1968. But he said there was an OEAA, the forerunner of that, and there was an office in New Orleans. But then he says something very interesting for those of you that have tape recorded or want a copy of this. He said, upon request, this is James Earl Ray saying it, direct quote, upon request, the late Clyde Watts, an attorney in Oklahoma, investigated in 1964, reported thereafter that Randolph Irvin Rosen was, in fact, Randolph Irvin Rosen's son. Now, some of you may wonder what in the heck that is about, because later one of the men said, why did you bring this up about Rosenson? And the committee, everyone left it blank. Mark Lane, the attorney for James Earl Ray, everyone left this space blank, and the name probably would skip you if you didn't know who Clyde Watts is. Now, in the first place, James Earl Ray described him as the late Clyde Watts. That's two of the major witnesses of this case that are dead. The other one is Wilson, the person who might have identified James Earl Ray at the gas station that Mark Lane said he saw in a hospital and interviewed and tape recorded. But then after that, after Mark's visit, Wilson had died. Well, I have to check the date now on Clyde Watts' death. He referred to him as an Oklahoma attorney, but I don't know why he says that in 1964 he investigated Rosen, because I wonder if James Earl Ray or Jerry Ray knew Clyde Watts in 1964. That's the year that he was very much involved in the John Kennedy assassination, Clyde Watts was the attorney for Major General Edwin Walker. And in 1964, he was called as an attorney for Walker to represent Walker before the Warren Commission. There were 552 witnesses before the Warren Commission, and only one man had an attorney with him, I believe, and that was Walker, General Walker, and the attorney was Clyde Watts, and that was happening in 64. And I wonder, the links of General Walker to the assassination of John Kennedy are enough. I'll do a whole tape for you sometime on that. But James Earl Ray used the date 1964, and Martin Luther King wasn't killed until 1968. Ray was still in the penitentiary, and he used the name Randolph Irvin Rosenson. In volume 11 of the Warren Commission hearings, there's the testimony of Major General Edwin Walker. It's on page 404 it begins. And as I say, I can do a whole program for you on it because it's very, very important to refresh your memory on the links of General Walker and the Texas racists, the connections to the Southwest. But pages 404 to 434 of the Warren Commission hearings has General Walker, Major General Edwin Walker, as a witness before the Warren Commission with this Clyde Watts, who James Earl Ray is referring to, and I don't know where James Earl Ray got his name. And I think this is important because of Jerry Ray and Stoner connections to General Walker, why James Earl Ray brought it up at this time. And I got out my volume of commission hearings, volume 26, page 474 and 475. And there's an affidavit signed by a William McEwen Duff, D-U-F-F, and a message, it was given May 26, 1964, and James Earl Ray is referring to that year, 64, from Secret Service agent, a special agent, James R. Cantrell, from the U.S. Treasury Department in Oklahoma City. And he's there because a certain man, William McEwen Duff, is in the custody of Clyde Watts. And the Secret Service report said that Mr. Duff claimed that there was an association between Jack Ruby, who had earlier killed Lee Harvey Oswald, and General Edwin A. Walker from Dallas, Texas, and that during that period of December 1962 through March of 63, while Duff was employed by General Walker, he resided in his home. Jack Ruby visited the home of General Walker once a month. Each time he was in the company of two unidentified white males. He arrived in a Ford car. Duff claimed the identification of Ruby through photographs. He heard him addressed only as Jack, and he described the other two males that were at the home of General Walker. Duff advised that the three had always convened with Walker in the living room of the Walker residence. Duff couldn't hear their conversations, at no time overheard them, but saw the man, Ruby, and knew him by the name of Jack. Duff fled, and he went to Oklahoma. He said he felt he knew too much about General Walker's operation and of the persons visiting his residence, intimating that Walker was diverting funds collected from the John Birch Society to a personal account at the Highland Park Bank in Dallas, Texas. Duff had called Secret Service agent Cantrell on long-distance telephone from Lawton, Oklahoma in May of 64 to advise that the man who offered him $10,000 if he would kill General Walker had been following him at Lawton. Remember, there was an attempt to shoot General Walker and then later blame it on Lee Harvey Oswald. Secret Service agent Cantrell said that in May 64 he received a long-distance telephone call from Mrs. Duff in which she said her husband had vital information in the case concerning the assassination of John Kennedy. Duff insisted that he had the truth, and he volunteered to tell them what he knew. Later, he got employment in Oklahoma City through General Clyde Watts, whom he described as an attorney in Oklahoma City and counsel for General Edwin Walker from Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Duff was reminded that by Duff that he was to contact James Cantrell of the Secret Service and give his information, but later he called his wife when he was in the custody of Clyde Watts in Oklahoma, the attorney, and he said, "You notify Secret Service agent Cantrell that I'll be done, that I cannot be called as a witness, that I'll be killed," and we never heard any more about Mr. Duff, whether he's alive or dead. I'll have to check with Penn Jones and see if he heard any more, but he claims that he knew a lot about General Walker and Clyde Watts, and then he went to work for Watts. He hired him in Oklahoma City, this person that used to work for Walker in Texas. General Watts found employment for me as a heavy equipment operator in road construction in Oklahoma City by reason of his former association with General Walker. I say volume 26, I'll give you the page numbers on the bibliography, describes Mr. Duff and his relationship to Clyde Watts and General Walker. Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is side 351, tape number 351, September the 1st, 1978. I want to continue on this side of the tape talking about the testimony of James Earl Ray before the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigating the murder of Martin Luther King. Public hearings that were on television, national television, the week of August the 16th, 17th, and 18th, 1978. For parts that are left out of the House Select Committee investigation, those of you that don't have my tape number 294, that was November the 6th, 1977. I have a tape on Robert Watson regarding the Martin Luther King assassination and alleging that the syndicate and coin operators and gun runners, narcotics operators, were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Robert Watson was a witness to some of this, and he's in a federal penitentiary. And if all goes well, and if he keeps quiet, I guess, and behaves himself, he'll be out in the spring of this next year. But you can get copies of an article written by David Wemple. I think I should be able to copy them for you. I haven't done it, and I'll get his address maybe for next week. And you can get this long article upon which this broadcast was based that I did on the Martin Luther King assassination. For those of you who take the tapes regularly, and for new people that subscribe, get along with it after a month goes by or in the future, and they're listening to these tapes, some of you may or may not know the running controversy that I've had with Mark Lane, the investigator, who's now the attorney for James Earl Ray. And I want to comment a little bit about Mark Lane's behavior at these hearings and a few things that I observed to illustrate the complaint that I have against Mark. You can get the past tapes. They're itemized and listed if you want them, with comments about him. But specifically in terms of these hearings, he did play an important role in showing how the committee worked. I thought that in some ways he was very good. A lot of people thought he was offensive in his manner. He has an Emile Zola complex, the attorney that freed Alfred Dreyfus in France, and he keeps saying, the American people won't stand for this, the American people won't stand, as if he is the sole defender of our civil liberties and rights. And I noted every time he said that, he continuously accused the committee of a lot of connivance. And even on national television, they were doing many things that the Warren Commission did. And I think it was very useful that Lane was able to illustrate them as they went along. And in some ways, he was letting his client down terribly, or as you say crudely, he's simply screwing him against the wall. And in other ways, he gives the appearance of being very angry and distraught with the committee. He argued first about their withholding all the evidence, the written notes that James Earl Ray had given William Bradford Huey 6 and 7 years ago, and yet they wanted to remember every single name of every motel and incident 10 years later, which is an impossibility. I know I stayed in 2 or 3 different motels on my 2-week vacation to Canada, and if I had to give sworn testimony or even were hypnotized, I don't think I could remember the names of the places with the exception of one, because we had stayed there a few years before. And I made a point of remembering it. I can't tell you where I stayed, and certainly I don't think it would be useful 10 years from now. So Mark Lane wanted this information and had a struggle with the committee to get it. He also challenged what was known as the Garner document. They were presenting information that was unsigned and no proof that this party saw it, and they presented this to the committee to challenge James Earl Ray. They had statements of a Mr. Woods regarding the selling of ammunition. This took place 10 years later, and James Earl Ray and Mark Lane didn't have the documents in front of them. They showed a newspaper that was printed in Los Angeles that said that Reverend Martin Luther King was going back to Atlanta and that he would have these marches. And it was a little piece of paper, undated, no page number, no date. And the suggestion was that as soon as the newspaper came out in Los Angeles, that James Earl Ray could have read it and therefore decided to change his address and go to Atlanta, Georgia. And Mark Lane was very useful in showing that James Earl Ray asked for post office change of address to Atlanta, Georgia on a given date, and the newspaper they were citing was published the day after he had applied for a change of address. And furthermore, he had testified that when he saw Raoul in Mexico, in December, Raoul said, "Be in New Orleans, come back east in March." So the decision was made in December that he would be back there in March, and it wasn't made after he read a newspaper. Yet the committee has been spending millions of dollars on this kind of nonsense, and Mark Lane was very useful in showing the way they turned dates around to try to nail James Earl Ray on public television as following Martin Luther King through the newspaper and then picking up roots and stalking him, so to speak. They also used a witness, Martin Eist from London, a policeman with the London police, 26, 28 years, who was arrested, charged with perjury, removed from the police department, involved with some jewel robberies, was a known perjurer, and yet this committee went to London and sent an investigator and took his recalling what James Earl Ray said 10 years ago and using that before the committee as a so-called bombshell to nail James Earl Ray without giving the criminal background of the person who was charging James Earl Ray with admitting that he killed Martin Luther King. Mark Lane noticed another document that they gave James Earl Ray that was doctored, and he asked them to review it, and he accused the committee of being unfair and using falsified documents to confuse and discredit the witness. They also presented an interview that Dan Rather made with James Earl Ray, and they presented only a few pages for confirmation of the contents in it, and not the entire report, which James Earl Ray was promised and never received. And Mark Lane was pretty much on his toes in watching the committee. He was, as I say, obnoxious to some. If he were an honest person, I could stand the being obnoxious. I'm telling you the good things about his presentation, or what I thought was fair, before I get to the really bad. He also challenged one other document that was fraudulent and said it was presented to the news media so that the world would see that James Earl Ray was being discredited by this document. And Mr. Pryor, I believe, or Mr. Stokes said, well, they'll have a chance to read it later in the printed page, and they can judge for themselves. It doesn't really work that way. I have some testimony of the Senate Select Committee and different congressional investigations, and, of course, the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission report. But very few people buy from a government printing office. There's one in Washington, one on Golden Gate in San Francisco. My catalogs from the government printing office never have this kind of testimony, or hardly ever. It just has a list of a lot of trivia you can send for. So it's hard to see the printed word and compare it and know what's true. And they tried to admit a lot of things that cast aspersions against James Earl Ray and would confuse the listener because their first image set on the media is the one that really stays in their mind. The committee acted as if they were really trying to find witnesses who would know that James Earl Ray and Raoul were together, that Raoul wasn't a figment of the imagination of James Earl Ray. But James Earl Ray said that they knew that they were doing illegal things. He mentioned 30 or 40 of them. And outside of gun running and narcotic smuggling, we don't know what the other 28 were, but he knew they were doing illegal activity. And it's very seldom that two criminals sit in public places where they go around identifying and introducing themselves. They take places that are empty, or they meet surreptitiously, and it's very hard to make yourself public if you know that you're doing something illegal, both of you. I know that when you were in a restaurant or a public place, if I was on a ferry going over to Canada, or in restaurants or bus stations or where public parks. I'm sure that somewhere along the route in the past year, I have been in the company of two people having a discussion about some illegal act. Whether in a crowded restaurant or a small place, I'm sure you have too. But the fact that these acts take place later, or if one of them is involved in a murder, or one of them is framed, or kidnapping, or gun running, or narcotic smuggling, we would never recognize these people. I'm sure that they go to shopping centers like anybody else and go to the Safeway and buy their groceries and go about their business and go to the post office and pick up mail. After a crime is committed, we sometimes get a picture, but there is no picture of Raoul. That doesn't mean that he doesn't exist. It means that James Earl Ray and he never went together to public places and introduced each other as Mr. Eric Gault and Mr. Raoul. There's no reason for James Earl Ray to open a vault in a bank account in Birmingham. He never explained what he did that for. But the committee kept stressing and implying if there was no Raoul, then it must be a figment of James Earl Ray's mind. And then they kept looking for witnesses, some witness that would see him at the time of the shooting. If he wasn't in the bathroom of the rooming house shooting Martin Luther King, who would be a witness for James Earl Ray? Well, an article came out that several parties, it was in the National Enquirer, were witnesses that they were with James Earl Ray, and one of them was a Mr. Wilson. And he said that he saw Ray at a service station. This was in the National Enquirer. And the questioning came from Mr. Edgar from Pennsylvania on the House Select Committee. And he asked James Earl Ray about this Mr. Wilson, and he referred to an article that was in the National Enquirer about Mr. Wilson, and he implied that Mark Lane got his information from the National Enquirer. And Mark Lane got simply furious, and he said, no, I didn't. He said, I interviewed Mr. Wilson in the hospital. Mr. Wilson died. He died just a few weeks before the House Select Committee investigation. He's a man that would have substantiated James Earl Ray's story. And they said, I went to the hospital, and Wilson is dead and can't verify James Earl Ray's story. And he said, I don't get my information from the National Enquirer. I go directly for the person. I didn't refer to the article. They said that he referred to an article. Lane said, I didn't refer to an article. I saw these two men personally. I taped them, and I interviewed them. And I never said anything about a newspaper or those two men, one of them, Mr. Wilson, who's now dead. And he said the paper also refers to Grace Walden. You remember her. It refers to her. Now, here is a point, and I'm going really slowly on this, and it's important. Grace Walden, who also went by the name of Grace Stevens, was living with a man who owned the rooming house on 422.5 South Main Street. He didn't own it. I'm sorry, he shared a room there. Charles Quitman Stevens occupied 2 rooms in the rooming house, the same rooming house where James Earl Ray checked in. And at the time that Martin Luther King was killed, Mr. Stevens was the sole witness, and his common-law wife, Grace Stevens, Grace Walden, was at the rooming house also. And he turned out to be the only single witness who said that he could identify the person who left the room, the bathroom, and went out of there. He heard a shot. A man ran out, and he would identify him. The trouble was that he was picked up that same day. He was drunk. He was so drunk that he was not believable even the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. But Stevens was the key, according to Harold Weisberg, of explaining, this is in quotes, the unending official violations of the law and suppressions of the real story, why none of the evidence in the transcript will ever be made available to anybody. For what Stevens was persuaded to swear was that if there were a trial and he were cross-examined, he would say that James Earl Ray was the person who left this rooming house. Now, he was shown a picture by the FBI of Mr. Gault's identification picture, and he said, according to the New York Post, the photograph doesn't register. Unless he was wearing a wig or had a facelift or something, it's not the man I saw. The hair is too full, the face is too young, but he described the fleeing man as having long hair. And Stevens was living in this rooming house with Grace Walden. That's the Grace Walden that Mark Lane refers to while his client, James Earl Ray, is before national television with the House Select Committee on Assassination. They've spent $3 to $4 million already. His client is trying to show that he didn't kill Martin Luther King. And they're fishing for some witness that will show where James Earl Ray was at the time of the murder. But just as important is to show where James Earl Ray is to show that the person who left the rooming house was not James Earl Ray. Now, Grace Walden was living in that rooming house, and she lived with Mr. Stevens, and she said that the person that she saw there was not James Earl Ray. And while he was taken by the police department and taken on a vacation into an air-conditioned fine place and wined and dined, she was incarcerated into a mental hospital where she was kept until this year. And she was locked up because her identification was different from what the official story was of James Earl Ray being in the bathroom. Now, after 10 years, Mark Lane went to the hospital where Grace Walden Stevens was confined. And he has a lawsuit against the government for false confinement of Grace Walden because it's his allegation that she recognized a person other than James Earl Ray leaving the rooming house and occupying the rooming house. Now, Mark Lane referred to her before the committee that her name was in the National Enquirer article. And yet, when he was screaming and yelling about the American people won't stand for this and won't stand for that, I don't know why the testimony or the affidavit of Grace Walden was not presented to soften the story that James Earl Ray was presenting. It would back up what he was saying. They could have asked him if he, in fact, had seen her, if she had seen him, if he had seen anybody by the name of Mr. Stevens. The question always was to prove that James Earl Ray was guilty. No matter who was asking the questions, that was the line of reasoning. And yet, Mark Lane was sitting there and didn't introduce the idea that there were people who could confirm it was not Ray in the rooming house. As James Earl Ray said, if I were going to shoot Martin Luther King, I wouldn't leave my fingerprints on the rifle and leave it right there for everyone to see. I could have used, he said, mayonnaise on my hands or Band-Aids. Also, buying binoculars to look over makes him look twice as guilty as just having a rifle with a scope. And I'm sure as instructed, he said, Raoul told me to buy binoculars, because in the time it would take Martin Luther King to leave a motel room to go out to dinner at 6 o'clock, if you're going to stand there looking with binoculars, you're not going to have time to put them down and get out your rifle, and the rifle had a scope. So the binoculars are not of much use, and they were superfluous, but another instrument with fingerprints to make James Earl Ray look guilty. Clyde Watts, the attorney that James Earl Ray referred to, he called the late Clyde Watts, is dead, and it seems that Mr. Wilson, the important witness that could have supported James Earl Ray's story, died just 2 weeks before the House Select Committee got their story going. Congressman Stokes said, now that car with the name Rosen, what would that tell us about Raoul? I talked about on the other side of this tape, on tape 350. And he says, what's that got to do with Raoul? And James Earl Ray says, well, after I found out his correct name was Rosenson, then I went out and got the transcript to an attorney in Memphis, an attorney by the name of Merchant J. Ryan. And he went down and got the transcript from the Fifth Circuit archives. And I threw it away because the only thing I wanted to know was the fact that Rosenson was a pauper, but that he had 3 or 4 expensive attorneys from New Orleans. And later on, Mr. Ryan told me that Mr. Rosenson was an FBI informer. So I think things like that should have been looked into. And I don't know if there ever was or not. Now, this name of Rosenson was in James Earl Ray's car, as I said. But what is he talking about? An attorney by the name of Ryan in Memphis, Tennessee, and the Fifth Court archives. Where did he get these court records? Where did he find out that the name of the man's card, that party that was in his car, was an FBI person? The committee didn't answer any of those questions. They have absolutely no intention of going into any of the conspiratorial aspects of this, and he left it open. And James Earl Ray said, well, I think it's interesting that this card was in my car. And Mr. Stokes says, well, what does that have to do with Rowell? And Ray said, well, possibly Rowell dropped that card in my car, the name of this FBI informer from New Orleans. I found it down in the gearbox in my seat, and I think you should investigate it and see if there's any connection of Mr. Rosenson to the man who used the alias Rowell, who also was from New Orleans. And Mr. Stokes says, are you saying that Randy Rosenson could possibly be Rowell? And James Earl Ray said, no. I saw his picture. He is not Rowell. But in respect to Rosenson, possibly the government was trying to frame him, and the government, in courtroom testimony, has made attempts to frame him, and I don't know anything about it. And so he's asking them to look into this, that he's not saying it is the person he knows, but maybe if you found Rosenson, you'd have another clue to who Rowell is, because a lot of this was happening right down in New Orleans. That was the hub of activity for the John Kennedy assassination. And he's saying, look into Rosenson, and maybe you'll have a clue to the man you call Rowell. The committee is abysmally stupid all the way. And I can't believe they played that dumb and become members of the Congress of the United States, but maybe they do. Again, James Earl Ray is talking about Rowell, and he also talks about checking out, doing gun running for them, and then buying a gun and using the name John Willard because he is going to do something not exactly legal. He says something's going on, so I use the name John Willard at the rooming house because something is going on that's not exactly legal. And Stokes says, something not legal going on? You had reference to gun smuggling. Isn't that it? No, that isn't it. He took one single gun out of a case and put it under his bed in a rooming house, and he knew he was a co-conspirator in something because he said he made the phone calls to check what came down, and he said he knew he'd only get 15 years, but they wouldn't have anything to pin on him. A murder is illegal, I think it is, and Stokes doesn't ask the question, was the gun going to be used for murder, or was it used for murder? He says, you had reference to gun smuggling, and just taking a single gun and putting under a bed in a crummy rooming house like that is hardly gun smuggling. And yet Stokes does not refer, Congressman Stokes, to the fact that a murder took place in that city, in Memphis, Tennessee, just not too many feet away from that window. They all play dumb and spend time asking stupid questions, and I've typed them all up, and they're just sickening, and if you get the transcript, you'll be able to read them. Mark Lane was ranting and raving when the testimony of the Englishman, the cop, is not testimony, but it was an interview in London, was presented, and he started screaming about the credibility of the committee. He said, you knew of this man's background, the one they had quoted. It is the height of irresponsibility to inform the American people of that background. If I didn't receive a phone call from a lawyer, a barrister in London, the American people would not know about the deceit of this committee. Then he said, this is probably the most outrageous thing this committee has ever done. It's outrageous. The American people are watching this. They are judging you. They are not judging anyone else here in this arena. Mark Lane was yelling. Well, I think Mark Lane is the most outrageous thing the committee has ever done. He set up that committee. He told them when they first got started, I will see that kooks and crazies like Mae Brussell and Penn Jones and Sherman Skolnick never get any questions to you, any information to you. The committee does not answer my letters. They do not answer telephone calls. He set up the ground rules of that committee, and I think the most outrageous thing the committee has ever done was to take orders from people like Mark Lane and get themselves into such a structure that people who have information on the assassination of Martin Luther King could never get to the committee, and now they've used up these millions of dollars, and they're a mockery, and the media will say, we told you, it was a show, a circus, it's a lot of brahoo, and these men have worked diligently, and they've come up with no conspiracy. That is the legacy of Mark Lane, not of Mr. Blakey. That is what he did, and I have documents and letters and phone calls to prove it, and he had made up his mind that anything that I specifically have to say can never get to this committee. There was a lot of talk during the hearing of the possibility that James Earl Ray was stalking Martin Luther King, yet it never came out the subject of the mathematical chances of James Earl Ray even getting to a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, and having a room with a view of where Reverend Martin Luther King would check in and walk out a balcony at that time of the day. James Earl Ray wasn't in the room all the time. He was out, and it would be impossible to know in a city that size where he's going to stay, what his room number is going to be, and to have any kind of a gunman, much less a bumbler like James Earl Ray, right on the spot. The only people that would know where George Wallace was, or where John Kennedy was, or Martin Luther King, are the FBI and the local police. There were plenty of FBI there to protect, in quotes, Martin Luther King. And these are the people, the security people at the Ambassador Hotel would know what door Robert Kennedy was going out, and the guards would know where he was going. The mathematical chances of James Earl Ray locating in a city a room with a view of Martin Luther King are so minute. If he shot from the street or in a car, or if he read that Martin Luther King was having lunch at the Lorraine Motel, if he were shooting in front of the restaurant, but from a room, assigned room, it's just impossible to know where he is staying and sleeping. That wasn't published anywhere. And to have a view of his room. Now, the police and firemen had a view down below, and somebody down the bushes could have a view of that whole balcony if you had to cross that balcony to come out. The woman who signed the room to Martin Luther King, he was supposed to stay in another motel, and then the plans were changed at the last minute, and the woman who made arrangement for the plans that located him in this particular room died within a week after Martin Luther King. She had a stroke and a heart attack. There were different stories about her death. It's been so long since I read those papers, I think it was within a week or 2 weeks, she was dead, the woman that located him in that room. The question is, did anybody call and want to know what his room was? There were a lot of news media people around and so forth. What her contacts were, or who she told, or what happened, we don't know. But she also died very quickly after he had his hotel accommodations changed. But there's no way that James Earl Ray would have any way to know what room Martin Luther King was in, and to be out there at that bathroom window is a public bathroom in the rooming house, just sitting there with a rifle waiting to see. From 6 to 7 o'clock, somebody might have had to go pee, and Martin Luther King might have had a late dinner, and James Earl Ray would be standing there with a rifle. I don't think there's any chance that he would have done it that way. There were certain things on my mind as I listened to the tapes of the TV broadcast and the House Select Committee. I've always believed that James Earl Ray worked with Jerry Ray, closely with Jerry Ray, his brother, who is employed and paid by Mr. Stoner of the States Rights Party, the racist, the Nazi, the anti-Semite in the South. And I believe that Stoner would have the connections to the people that wanted Martin Luther King killed. But there was one thing that came up in these hearings that confuses me, and maybe you can think about it. If James Earl Ray were involved and paid by these many people that put up money to kill Martin Luther King, he would know that after serving a certain amount of time in prison, he'll probably get out, even though he has that 99-year sentence. But a year after Martin Luther King was killed and James Earl Ray had been in jail just his first year, John Ray, his brother, was involved in several bank robberies, and he refers to those, and he said Judge Webster gave him 17 years. And his brother Jerry was also involved in some illegal activities and arrested. And it would seem to me that if James Earl Ray were a patsy and were serving time, that some money would be filtered out to Jerry Ray and John Ray. If they were doing this on their own, they had too much access to falsified documents, passports, aliases, and so forth. But if they were doing it with a group, and even on a need-to-know basis, it would seem to me that some small amount of money would be given to each of them, Jerry Ray and John Ray, and not force the brother into multiple bank robberies and put him in jail for 17 years. If the family was involved, it seems to me that some money trickling to them, even just a couple of $100 a month or in a vault or savings account, would be appropriate, or paid in cash that they didn't have to account for. But it seems to me that if the brothers were involved, putting them in jail would cause them to talk to another cellmate and break the chain of connection if there was a conspiracy in the Martin Luther King case. I believe there is, and I always believed that the Ray brothers had a role in it. But sending one brother off or having him forced to be so poor that he's doing bank robberies the year after his brother is arrested for killing Martin Luther King doesn't make sense to me. And I can't figure out why he would be doing that and why he wouldn't paid off. If I had hired James Earl Ray or promised money to the Ray family, I would take care of these guys along the way so that they don't squeal and don't get punished, because then they could give out information that others might want to learn about in exchange for their future freedom. There were 3 days of testimony of James Earl Ray. If you want the tapes, as I said on the other side, they are available from the Tape Center. There's a lot of unanswered questions here because I'm just doing 1 hour on James Earl Ray's testimony. But if there are things that you want me to comment on it particularly, telephone me or write me a letter, and I'll incorporate it into tapes in the future. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be with you next week on September the 8th.